the demand for THC isolate in diamonds is off the hook right now, but producing it at scale can be a challenge. In this video, I'm going to dive into the secrets to making THC diamonds in as little as 24 hours and growing batches of 20 kilos of THC isolate in just a few hours. I'll also talk about some of the reasons why THC isolate is absolutely exploding in demand lately. We're also going to talk about some of the challenges and pitfalls that you're going to run into when scaling THCa production to industry-leading levels. And we'll dive into some of the solutions to overcome them. So if that sounds interesting, stick around for the rest of this video, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more great content like this. At Evolved Extraction Solutions, we help extractors thrive and gain a competitive edge in their extraction processes every day. And so we're often helping people scale up THC diamond production using diamond miners. Diamond miners have been one of our most popular products over the last couple of years, and we do recommend them for companies early in their growth trajectory. However, when reaching a certain level of production, let's say over 20 kilo per week of diamonds, they do start to become a challenge. There's this effect I call hitting the ceiling, and it's where diamond miners are stacked on shelves and they're just one after another, sometimes in 40 or 50 in a room. It takes up a lot of space in the extraction facility. The output on diamond miners is pretty slow. It can take a couple weeks to turn them around. When you have dozens of them, it can be quite labor intensive to manage all of them, and they take up a lot of space. On top of that, the terp sauce can be a bit of a challenge to separate from the diamonds, and a lot of people use centrifuge on top of that. But ultimately, the baskets are pretty small, and that means your batches are going to be small, and so you're never going to 10x your production using a centrifuge. So if we're going to 10x our production, we need to start doing this on a larger scale. And that's where THC isolate reactors come in handy. And we'll jump into some of those large scale reaction processes where you can actually isolate THC isolate at 20 or even 30 kilograms at a time. But before we get into that, let's dive into why and how THC isolate is crystallized. THC isolate will crystallize when it reaches supersaturation in a solution. And there's actually 3 ways you can get THC isolate to become supersaturated. 1, the solvent evaporates, increasing the concentration of THC isolate in the solution. 2, the temperature of the solution drops, lowering the solubility in the solution. 3, the pressure of the solution increases, lowering the solubility. So the ability to control these 3 parameters are the key to scaling up THC isolate if you want to 10x your production. In order to control these 3 parameters, you need a specialized crystallization reactor. Let's check out this process and equipment in action. We're here in the Genome Technology Center with this dual crystallization reactor. The reactor is set up in line with the Genome hydrocarbon extraction platform, but you can set this up with any butane extraction system in line with the system. Just like any hydrocarbon extraction, the biomass is contained in the material column. The solvent floods the material column and dissolves any of the crude oil that's contained in there. Then that solution passes through the rest of the system, collecting the collection vessel. At this point in the process, the solution flows into this crystallization vessel. At this point, it's actually doubling as a collection vessel where it can concentrate the solution down so that it gets close to its level of supersaturation. You'll see that there's large bore hoses that can allow for maximum flow of solvent vapor out of the system. So as solvent evaporates, we get closer and closer to the point of supersaturation of THCa in the solution, but we want to stop before the crude gets too thick to cause a reaction. Once the perfect ratio of crude oil and solvent is achieved, then we can switch from solvent recovery to our crystallization function. In order to initiate the reaction, the THCa needs to become supersaturated in the solution, meaning the solvent no longer has the capacity to keep all the THC dissolved. As long as the viscosity of the solution is at the optimal level when you start the reaction, as soon as the solubility of the solution drops, the THCa isolate will completely precipitate out of the solution in almost like a chain reaction. After your extraction process, your solution is going to be collected in this vessel. So you're going to keep evaporating off solvent until the solution gets to about a 1-to-1 ratio of solvent and crude oil. Once you get to that ratio, you're going to be pretty close to the level of supersaturation. And so that's the point where you want to start cooling this vessel so that you can prevent any further evaporation. This is where the ability to switch from heating to cooling becomes very important in this process. Because of the HMI control system for the heating and cooling, it means that we can stop the evaporation at a very precise point. It also means that we can switch from heating to cooling, which allows for the crystallization process. Now, since the solution is already at close to the point of supersaturation, dropping the temperature in this vessel will actually push it past the point of supersaturation, causing that cascading reaction of crystallization and precipitating the THCa out of solution. The temperature needs to actually drop at a very controlled and consistent rate to create the right size crystalline structure. If you drop the temperature too quickly, it ends up creating almost like a fine powder isolate, and that becomes very difficult to filter out of the system. If you do it too slowly, then obviously it's taking a lot more time, and crystals will grow larger and they'll be easier to filter, but it won't be quite as efficient. Getting the THC to isolate and crystallize in a consistency similar to granular sugar is going to be ideal for this process, but it'll also help us grow larger diamonds. And we'll talk about that a little bit later on in the video. Some crude, for example, when it comes from lower quality biomass, can be a little bit more challenging to initiate the crystallization reaction. So having a few different tools in our tool belt, such as the ability to redissolve the solution or the ability to inject cold propane into the solution, can also affect the crystallization reaction and help it precipitate in more challenging reactions. Now that we've completed the crystallization reaction, we can now drain off and filter the remaining solution. And that solution will contain the high terpene extract, which will be collected in this vessel. And so that solution can then be boiled off and we can get to a high terpene concentrate. Once we've boiled off most of the solvent from the high terpene solution, we're left with a high terpene concentrate that's very low in THC. After draining off the high terpene solution from this vessel and filtering it, we can continue to pour really cold solvent over the THC crystals and continue to increase their purity by washing them. After the THC isolate has been washed and purified in this vessel, we'll end up with about 20 kilograms of isolate in this vessel. In order to easily remove 20 kilograms of THC isolate from this reactor, we want to redissolve it by first adding more butane to the system, heating the vessel, and turning on the agitator. Then we want to reconcentrate the solution by evaporating off some of the solvent to get it to something along the lines of a spray foam-like consistency. So it's still a liquid when we empty it, but we're also minimizing how much solvent is in the solution when it comes out of the vessel. The spray foam consistency is great if you want to make THC isolate for other products like vape carts. But if you want to grow larger diamonds, then you really want to reconcentrate that solution back down to about a 50-50 solvent to THC isolate ratio. Using a solution of pure THC isolate and butane makes for an incredibly efficient process as a diamond. Clients that we've helped implement this process have been able to grow 1 gram diamonds in as little as 24 to 36 hours. Going from 3 weeks down to 36 hours in the diamond mining process is a remarkable 10 times improvement over using just diamond miners or jar tech alone. So there are a lot of pitfalls to avoid when doing large-scale crystallization, and we're going to help you solve those. But before we do, I want to talk about why I think THC isolate is absolutely exploding in demand right now. The demand for THC isolate is absolutely exploding because of the versatility of its function. You can use THC isolate in basically any product as a raw ingredient for formulations. For one, it can be decarboxylated and turned into a very similar product to distillate that's great for vape carts, edibles, and a whole range of other products. The clients we've helped implement these processes use the versatility of THC isolate to their advantage. For example, the THC isolate made from fresh frozen biomass or from cured biomass is exactly the same. So really the variability all comes from the high terpene extract. So the isolate then just becomes a bulk material that you can melt down, turn it into liquid diamonds, and use that for formulations for vape cartridges. And what we find is that from a live resin extraction, you end up with such an abundance of terpene extract that you're able to make actually about twice as many live resin vape carts with that. It also means that your products will spend a lot less time on your shelves before shipping to the retailer or the distributor, and they can actually be formulated on demand in a lot of cases. Okay, we're joined here with our chief engineer at Genome Technologies, Lyndon Noble. Thanks for joining us, Lyndon. And we're going to talk a little bit about how to avoid some of the pitfalls that come up when you're dealing with large-scale THC crystallization. So, Lyndon, when you're scaling up THCa crystallization, what do you think is the most prevalent issue for our viewers to watch out for?
Yeah, the most challenging situation that we encounter is really when you have low THCa in your crude or a high amount of THCa that's already been decarboxylated.
So it's like low quality crude, essentially.
Yeah. the lower the quality of the crude, the lower the cost of your biomass inputs, in general can yield a harder crystallization.
So examples of this might be like old biomass that's been sitting around. A lot of that THC is now decarboxylated just from sitting there, and then that ends up in your crude. So it's resisting crystallization.
Yeah, exactly. The THC will inhibit that crystallization process, and also there's just less THCa in the solution to begin with, and so it's harder to get to that super saturation point where crystals will form.
Okay, and so what are some kind of ways that you can deal with that?
Yeah, so there's kind of three main things that we'll do to address that situation. First, what we'll try and do is manipulate the temperature, because that's easiest. We'll go a little bit colder and see if we can get it to crash.
Okay.
Then we'll inject propane. Sometimes that'll help us because THCa is less soluble in propane than it is in butane. You can get the crash to happen that way.
Okay.
Or the third and one of the most effective ways that we have to deal with really low THCa crude is to actually add more THCa to the solution from a previous crystallization.
Interesting.
And that can help that crystallization.
So you're almost like seeding it.
Yeah, exactly. We're increasing the ratio of THCa to THCa.
Okay, so it's not seeding it, but it brings up the THCa level to the point where it's going to reach supersaturation.
That's exactly it. Yeah, seeding is more when you're growing crystals and
Right.
forming the glacial points. This is just manipulating
The ratios.
the ratios. Yeah.
What's another way that people get hung up when they're trying to do crystallizations?
Yeah, another really common one is that they'll have too much solvent in their solution when they're trying to perform their crystallization. It'll be too dilute. What'll happen is when you're really dilute, you'll slowly start to grow crystals as opposed to, crashing them out by being super saturated. And so you'll kind of be spinning and you'll see a little bit of crystallization happening, but it's a challenging one to diagnose until you've seen it a few times because it looks like your crystallization is happening, but ultimately it's not going to propagate fully. And so what we'll do to mitigate that is we will heat the solution back up, we'll remove a little bit more solvent, and then we'll do the crystallization again.
Okay, so the ability to redissolve that solution and start over is kind of critical in that then.
Yeah, exactly. If you try and take that solution all the way to the point where you're filtering it, it's a huge waste of time essentially. And so having the ability to instantly switch it back to heating mode, pull off a little bit of solvent to resaturate, and then switch it back to cooling mode to do your crystallization again allows you the maneuverability to adjust your solvent ratio really, or your dilution amount.
Okay, and if you can't do that and you have to push it downstream, you said it's a waste of time. What exactly makes that a waste of time?
Well, what'll happen is if you are way too dilute, you'll start forming some THCa crystals, but a lot of the THCa will stay in solution. And then so when you go to wash the crystals that you do have, unfortunately, you'll wash that HTE away, which will wash away a lot of your desirable compounds.
So a lot of the THCa will end up in the HTE fraction.
Yeah, and you might not realize it until you've sent your HTE out for testing. And,
Right.
And really the effective, the way that we mitigate against that is by recognizing the visual cue that your crystallization is propagating too slowly and it's not happening correctly, and then you can adjust for it.
Got it. Okay, so that's if you're too dilute on the solution going into your crystallization. What about the opposite?
So too concentrated is an issue that we don't have to spend a lot of time explaining in general because you end up with a thick toffee or a rock at the bottom of your crystallizer and you can't get it to mix. Really understanding why that's an issue though is really that the THCa molecules can't find each other and so they can't form crystals and they can't properly crystallize out.
It's basically crude.
Yeah.
It just becomes the normal crude oil that people drain out of their hydrocarbon extractor that obviously is not in crystal form.
Yeah. And there's one sort of saving grace when you're in that situation is that often when if you're pretty thick, but you can still mix it a little bit, oftentimes you will be able to supersaturate it, and we found that we can inject cold solvent at that time and we can get the crystallization reaction to happen. So you can kind of save the process without having to do very much extra work. That being said though, if you are too concentrated and you've injected solvent, you can't get that crystallization reaction to go.
Right.
The solution is the same. You heat up the jacket of your crystallizer,
Right.
you redissolve the crude and remove the solvent again to get it to a little bit more dilute, a little bit lower viscosity of the solution,
Right.
and do the crystallization again.
So you've got the ability to start over.
Yeah.
And it's not too painful.
Yeah.
The challenge is if you're doing it in like a column or something like that, you really can only go one way.
Yeah, you can only cool, and so you don't have the capacity to restart the process or adjust your solvent ratios or redissolve anything.
Right, having that mixture and having the ability to both heat and cool the vessel was the key differentiator there.
Yeah, you can imagine if you filled something that is only cold, that can only be cooled with a thick resinous solution, and you realize it's too thick, you could be days, you're going to be scraping that out and trying to redissolve it by performing some other step. It's very challenging to recover from that. And really the crystallizer, a lot of the times when you're processing a new crude, there's a lot to be learned. You'll watch, one of the things we'll do often is we'll boil all of the solvent off of a big batch to know exactly how much crude is in the vessel. And then we'll redilute it so that we have a more certainty around our ratios.
It sounds like you're getting to know the properties of the concentrate that you're working with, and it could be different from different growers. It could be different, maybe different lots.
It's different every time, really. And if for instance, a high amount of terpenes in a crude will actually significantly impact the viscosity. So
Really?
You'll be a lot less viscous while you're at those colder temperatures if you have a really terpene extract.
Interesting.
Yeah. So they're very different from extract to extract.
So, and then what if you have a concentrate that's really high in fats and waxes? Does that inhibit the crystallization process?
To a degree. So fats and waxes are pretty interesting in the sense that you'll still be able to crystallize a lot of the time, but there's a certain subset of fats and waxes that will precipitate out at the same time as THCa is.
Just like a de-wax. Sometimes you see like column de-wax or something in old school hydrocarbon systems.
Yeah. So the challenge with that is if you're precipitating THCa and the waxes are falling out at the same time, you end up with a waxy THCa isolate at the end of it, and that's obviously not desirable. So what we found the most effective way to do that is, the crystallization process is really similar to the de-wax process, with one main difference is that you can coagulate waxes when your solution is very dilute.
Oh, interesting.
So what we'll do is we'll fill the solution, we'll fill the collection pot up, or the crystallizer up with a bunch of solvent, we'll cool it down, and then the waxes will coagulate out.
Right.
And we'll filter those with one of our filters. And then
So there's a downstream filtration step that allows you to kind of keep your collection vessel clear of those waxes.
Exactly, yeah. We have a downstream filter where we will drain the crystallizer now with the coagulated waxes in it, deposit those waxes onto a filter, and then send it back to the crystallizer now devoid of those waxes.
Wow.
So you can perform the crystallization step.
What happens if you're dropping the temperature of the solution and you drop that temperature too quickly?
Yeah, what we found is that there's a strong correlation between how fast you cool and how fine the THCa crystals are. What we typically suggest operators do is they do kind of a ramping and a step function when they're cooling the crystallizer down. So we'll cool it down in steps to deliberately slow that crystallization down and try and get 100 micron crystals, crystals that are large enough that you can filter and wash them really easily.
So like table salt type of size?
Yeah, exactly. If you go right down to as cold as possible, your crystals will form into a much siltier, muddy like consistency.
Oh, really?
That's hard to clean off, as you can imagine. Hard to wash mud and get sand.
Well, the solution doesn't drain.
Yeah, exactly.
When you're performing a THCA crystallization, what are some of the things that could limit how much THCA actually ends up crystallized as opposed to in the solution?
Yeah, there's a bunch of factors. I think mostly what we're doing is we're trying to control the crystallization so that it's predictable and easy to wash. But also there's some equipment limitations to consider as well too. You need to, essentially, we're using the fact that THCA doesn't dissolve. Once it's already crystallized, it doesn't really readily dissolve in butane again. And so you can wash off the HTE. But what'll happen is if you have kind of these areas where the THCA has the opportunity to warm up, or if you're sending in solvent that's too warm, you will redissolve the THCA that you're trying to wash off. And so it's very important to have a jacket that completely covers the filtration area or any part of the vessel where you might be trying to wash those THC crystals off.
Or the crystallization component.
Yeah. The crystallization component, the filtration component, everything has to be kept very cold, and you can't have any hot spots essentially, because you'll start to form, shatter inside of your vessel, or you'll redissolve some of the THCa. So yeah, just temperature control is very important.
Why is it important to have the ability to redissolve and recrystallize the THCa?
Often what we're doing is multiple crystallizations in order to increase purity. But really the first crystallization is often a learning experience where you're seeing, at what solvent ratio is this going to crystallize? What does it look like when it crystallizes? What temperature are we at when it crystallizes? And in between those iterations, having the ability to redissolve your solution and start again is very important. And then even at the end of a crystallization, once you've got your pure THCa, if you're going to be transferring it to a miner, or you're going to be ejecting it from the system, often we will redissolve that THCa in order to perform those transfer steps.
After you perform the crystallization and you've drained the HT out of the crystallization vessel and done some solvent washing to wash away and purify, why is it important to be able to redissolve that THC isolate?
Yeah, there's a couple of reasons why you want to be able to redissolve your isolate. If you're going to be doing a second crystallization, you'll want to redissolve your THCa entirely before you start your second crystallization, so that you can get a uniform crystal size for washing. But also, if you're going to be ejecting the crystals or the THCa from the system, either into a diamond binder or just directly into isolate, it's most effective to redissolve into a solvent and transfer it as a fluid, or eject it from the system as a thick slurry that will then, foam up like spray foam almost, or Cheetos. We call it Cheeto tech often, where you've redissolved your THCa in butane and then heated it to the point where when you eject it from the system, there's enough residual heat in the solution that you're extruding the foam out of the system.
Okay, so there's both the pressure that you're creating, and then also you're heating it to concentrate it down to that consistency.
Yeah, because we don't want to be losing a lot of solvent while we're doing that process, but also opening up a crystallizer and trying to scoop THCa from the inside is challenging, and you can often incur losses, or you can have contaminants coming in.
Right.
So it's much easier to have it exit the system as a liquid.
Safer too.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a high-level look at some of the pitfalls and challenges you'll encounter with scaling up THC isolate production and how to address them. If you want to dive deeper in this subject and get an immersive, hands-on experience, right here at the Genome Technology Center, we offer an advanced seminar on THCa crystallization and diamond production. If you're interested, I encourage you to join our exclusive waitlist for free and gain priority access when tickets become available for the show. You'll also get access to exclusive content and network with top industry professionals. We limit the attendance at our seminars because we want every single participant to get an amazing experience hands-on with the instructors and with the equipment. But that also means that they sell out very quickly, so getting on the wait list will help your chances. At the end of the seminar, you'll come out with new skills and you'll be well on your way to industry leadership. Remember, seats are limited, but your potential is endless. Click the link in the description and join the wait list.